In the last weeks, I posted a couple of videos on the new Leica M10R. So this is the M10R here. And I also keep saying that people should actually get to know the sensor of a new camera if they purchased it, because it will help them for better photos later on. And that's the purpose of this video. So when we look here at the M10R, let's quickly remove the aposomicron here. You see here the shutter. So the shutter typically is closed, which protects also the sensor, of course. If you want to see the sensor, you can switch the camera on. It says no lens mounted, that's okay. And you can go here on the menu to sensor cleaning. Open shutter, inspect sensor. Yes, you heard the sound. Now the shutter is open. And we can see that brand new sensor in the camera here, which is nice. Of course, I'm going to close it right away. And then actually it should close after a moment. And the shutter will be protecting the sensor again, which is, I think, a good solution. You saw it now. This is closed here again. The shutter is closed. Let's get the lens mounted again. What I want to show in this video here is how people can explore the sensor of a new camera, and that's universally applicable in any situation where people purchase a new camera. And my advice is the little procedure I'm going to present in the few minutes of this short video is a very meaningful exercise for everybody who wants to do better photos and better understand how the sensor of a new camera is reacting to different exposure times, ISO values, and in general the noise behavior of the sensor in the camera. So let's get started with the video, and I hope you find this useful. Follow me until the end of the video, because I think it's a meaningful kind of algorithm I'm offering, getting to know a new camera sensor. And let's just get into the topic. So I'm sitting now outside in my backyard. Apologize if there is some background noise, but that's the best way to test the sensor of the Leica M10R, because I have enough light. I'm sitting under an umbrella. The sun is shining on the umbrella, which is almost like a studio light. Very nice. I have in front of me my Leica M10R, and the lens I've mounted is the aposomicron 50mm from the M lens series. And I have a subject, which you see here, sitting in the middle of that wooden table in my backyard. It's Mr. Loriot. Mr. Loriot was a German comedian. He died some time ago. Very famous in Germany, probably not known outside of Germany, but is a good subject for that little sensor test. And what you want to have is, in the test I'm going to do now, you want to have bright areas like this part here of the image, and you want to have dark areas. And you also want to make sure you get some kind of background blurriness or bokeh, because that helps you to detect noise in what we are going to do. The first shot we are taking here, let's first check sharpness. So let's get Mr. Loriot sharp on the eyes. I think that looks very good, looks sharp. And I have my aperture at f4, and you see here the ISO is at 100 and shutter speed is at 1/360. And you see here that the light is perfectly level metered. So this is just the correct exposure we are taking here. So let's take that shot. I do it with a timer in order to have no shakes and vibrations. And let's look at the result. And then we continue and work our way forward in that little sensor test I'm going to do in this short video. Shot has been taken. Let's see how Mr. Loriot is set in scene here. I think that looks nice. Yes, it's very sharp. You see the structure on the face. You see basically everything. And if you look in the background, you see some blurriness here. And we have that bright part of the image and the dark part of the image. I think that's actually good and is a very good start. Next image we are going to take is, we double the ISO. So we go to ISO 200. And of course, we also need to adjust then the shutter speed. So let's go here to 1/750. And again, we take the shot. Very good. Next shot is at an ISO of 400. Again, adjusting the shutter speed here. So we always check that this is level metered here on exposure taking. Let's take the shot. Very good. Let's continue. Let's go to an ISO of 800. Let's get this adjusted to 1/2000 seconds. Let's go to an ISO of 1600. Now we had 1/4000 seconds. And then if you want to have the aperture at f4, this is end of story, because we cannot be faster than 1/4000 seconds on the Leica M10-R. And that's why we would now have basically to stop down the aperture, which will kill probably the background blurriness to some extent. So let's stop down the aperture here. And this is underexposed. We need to go to 3200. Still, I think the sun is gone a little bit, so it still works. We get the correct exposure metering at 1/4000 seconds. I think we have some clouds now. So my scene here is not as bright as it used to be on the former shots. Let's just take the exposure and take the shot. Very good. And the next ISO stop we go for is 6400. And clearly now we have to be faster on the shutter speed, which is no longer possible. So now we stop down the aperture, and we have to stop this down now to f8. All right, I think that's it. I think the ISO range I want to cover is between 100 and 6400, which is exactly what we did. So the first part of the test is completed. Let's look at these images quickly in post, and let's see what we can learn, how this sensor is behaving. So for the second part of that short video and that little test or experiment with the Leica M10-R sensor, we have basically two directions. We want to underexpose an image by 3 stops, and we want to overexpose an image by 3 stops, and then correct for it in Lightroom or in Capture One, whatever is your post-processing tool, and see what we can learn from the behavior of the sensor in these situations, if we have underexposed and or overexposed images, and how we can compensate for that in post, and what level of noise it will introduce to the image. So we start again with an aperture of f4 and with an ISO of 100 on the ISO wheel here, and the correct exposure after metering here clearly is 1/250 seconds. So let's take that image. That's the correct exposure. And now let's underexpose by 3 stops, which is 1/500 is 1 stop, 1/1000 is 2 stops, and 1/2000 is 3 stops. And you see how the light meter here actually shows that this image is now strongly underexposed. You also see it when I measure light here and halfway press the shutter button. So let's take that image. And that is one direction of the test here. Now we see whether we can correct this in post-processing by 3 stops and what it does to the image. The second direction we want to go for is overexposing the image. So again, we have ISO 100, we have an aperture of f4, and the correct exposure is at 1/250 seconds. So we go now to 1/125, to 1/60, that's 2 stops, and 1/30, that's 3 stops. And you see here how this is appearing in the light meter here. And you see also if I halfway press the shutter button, this is completely overexposed now. So let's take the shot. The last kind of test we are doing is I'm going here now to an ISO of 800. So you see this here, and the correct exposure is 1/360. So that's the correct exposure. And then we do the same exercise what we did on stopping up and down on shutter speed. We do this on ISO. So let's see where we end up on this. Since the sun is permanently changing here and we have clouds and then no clouds, we have permanently to adjust the shutter speed. So we had 1/500 seconds. Let's go for this now. It will be a proxy, but it will help us, as you will see in post, to understand the behavior of the sensor. I'm actually at an aperture of f8 for this shot here. So that looks good. Let's go and overexpose the image. 1 stop further from 800 to 1600, 1 more is 3200, 1 more is 6400. And let's take the same shot. Same shutter speed. Now the image is completely overexposed. Let's go back to an ISO of 800 and let's stop down 3 times. That's 400, 200, 100. Let's take the shot again. Now it's underexposed as you see on the preview on the LCD. And then let's go into post. So I've now imported from the first sequence of shots the images into Capture One. So you see them here. Here's ISO 100, 200, 400. Here is ISO 800, 1600, 3200 and 6400. So we have them all imported. From a distance, they all look good actually. And what I want to do now in order to understand the noise behavior, we come to underexposure and overexposure in a moment with the different shots we've taken after that sequence here. I can hold the Shift key and go to 100% zoom here or crop, and then we see the images. And now we can go to different parts in the image, which is the same image but different ISO values, by again holding the Shift key and changing the image crop simultaneously. So first of all, if we look at the face here, these images are all sharp and they are all usable. If you remember on the last one here, ISO 6400, I actually had to stop the aperture down because otherwise the image would have been overexposed. So this is an f8 image. All the other images are taken with f4. And you see this here, basically, if you look into the background, here you have more structure because we stopped the aperture down. Here we have, on the 6 images here, we have an aperture of f4. So looking into the background here, we see that here you have in all 7 images acceptable levels of noise, which I think is remarkable. What you also see is that on the one with the highest ISO, 6400, you have a little less structure around the eyes here of my little subject than you have it on ISO 100. But in general, all these images, and remember we are here at 100% crop, are very much usable in terms of noise level. Let's go around a little bit in the image. Let's look at the chair here and the legs of the guy on the chair. It's actually even here you see that kind of breakup line in my subject. It's a lot of clarity, it's the full structure, and you have everything you want to have. If we go to the bright parts of the image, and that's why I said when I took the shots, make sure if you go through this procedure that you have dark areas and bright areas. Even in the bright areas, there is hardly any noise recognizable in the one with 6400 ISO. So that looks pretty impressive, pretty good. And in my previous videos on the Leica M10-R, I was already showing this, that ISO 6400 yields very usable results. And I think that's the normal standard range you should actually activate in the camera when you go on auto ISO. Make sure it's between 100 and 6400 and noise will not be an issue at all. And if there is some noise, you can also hex it away in post-processing if you want, without losing too much structure or clarity of the image. And all these images look clean and nice. I'm actually very positively surprised by what I'm seeing here on display when we go through these images. And the dark areas look good, the bright areas look good, the background looks good. You see some noise kicking in here at, you know, maybe 1600, but hardly noticeable. And the noise behavior of the new sensor of the new Leica M10-R is just remarkable when it comes to noise and higher ISO values. So this is now the second part of the exercise, which might be even more exciting. At least for me, that's always a good exercise when I want to become familiar with the new gear, new camera sensor. So we have here the sequence consisting of 3 shots. They are all at an ISO of 100. This one is the reference image. Let's call it the reference image. It has an exposure time of 1/250 seconds. Forget, by the way, about the aperture. As I explained in a different video on these Leica M rangefinder series cameras, there is no electronic contact, just an optical sensor, and it cannot transport the information what aperture you've chosen into the camera body and into your metadata. So the camera is doing a best guess, and that's typically not what it is. So these images have been shot with an aperture of f4, as I mentioned in the previous recording. This is the underexposed image with 1/2000 seconds, and this is the overexposed image with 1/30 seconds. This one and this one are exactly 3 stops away in different directions from the reference image. So what I want to do now is I want to match the exposure of the underexposed and the overexposed images with the reference image. And there is a tool in Capture One which is called normalized. It can be adapted by choosing white balance and exposure separately. And I'm not going to use it here. I do it manually by hand. So we know that the underexposed image should be give or take 3 stops away. So let's increase here by 3 stops on the exposure slider. And let's see what happens. I think that's almost good. As I said, it's not a scientific exercise. Let's go down a little bit to make the image more comparable. I think that's it. So around 2.7 stops in post-processing here. And we increase the value accordingly. And on the overexposed image, we have to decrease it. Let's try the same number. Let's say minus 2.7 stops. And I think that's pretty much it. These images are now very much comparable. Clearly, you have here on that image the highlight problem. And you see on the face and on the white areas that if we, let's actually zoom in simultaneously on these images. So you see you lose here the light blue color on the shirt of the guy. It's just white now. And that's a typical effect if you go from overexposure or highlights down and take exposure away with the slider. You might be able to adjust this in different ways. So for instance, we could bring down the highlights on that image here. Let's go into the image and let's see what happens if we decrease the highlights here. But even if we go to the extreme, it doesn't bring back the color. So the basic conclusion is if we go from underexposure to the correct exposure, we basically get everything back. I think if we look into that image, these images are absolutely the same now. Let's maybe go to 100% just for the sake of good governance on looking into that image. The color is slightly different, but you can fully recover everything on that image if it is underexposed by 3 stops in post-processing. And that's a very strong sign of an excellent dynamic range. As I mentioned in a previous video on the Leica M10-R when I did a shooting of the night sky and mountains at night, very strong dynamic range, looks really good. You can recover everything. You have no noise, absolutely no noise here by going in post-processing up by 3 stops in the bright areas as well as in the dark areas. So I think underexposure by 3 stops the camera can handle very well. If we go to the overexposed image, which is now matching, you lose some structure here. So if we look into the face, clearly you lose details. And you will not get these overblown highlights completely away. Clearly, if I would have not chosen to go for 3 stops difference, but for 2 stops difference, this would look already completely different. And if you want to get really impressed, we can choose here in Capture One the before and after representation. Then you see on the left-hand side before, on the right-hand side after. On the reference image, of course, there is no change. You can also slide this here and can in this way see what we did with our exposure matching. And I think 3 stops down or up, underexposure or overexposure is something the camera can handle. You will lose a little bit of structure if the highlights are blown out too much, but in general, all good. 2 stops, certainly no problem. So let's now go to the very last part of this exercise, or you might want to call this sensor analysis. So here we have now the reference image, which was shot with an ISO of 800. So a middle range of ISO and 1/360 seconds. Again, the aperture is not correct. We've taken this as an aperture of f8, if I remember correctly. And we have the underexposed image here with an ISO of 100 and the same shutter speed as on the reference image. And we have the overexposed image here with an ISO of 6400. And again, the same shutter speed as we have it here. So that's the situation we have. And now we do the same exercise. We increase here on the underexposed image by 3 stops. Becomes a little bit too bright. Let's go down. Let's see what we need to match this. I think that's about it. Yes, looks good. It's only accounting here in post-processing for 2 stops. Let's go to the overexposed image and let's adjust this down by 3 stops. And I think again here we need to go down a little more. I think that's about it. And if we look at that image, we should probably zoom into the 100% view here. Yes, quite remarkable. If you look at this here and compare the ISO 6400 image, you clearly lose here. I mean, again, it's almost impossible out of highlights when it is overexposed by 3 stops to fully recover everything. And you lose structure on the face, you again lose the color on the shirt, you lose the color face, but it's nevertheless absolutely remarkable what you can squeeze out of that absolutely hopeless image before. Let's look at before and after. And then let's see here, if you look into that, what it's getting out of the highlights and on the image on top of it, out of the shadows, is just remarkable. So again, I think shooting with ISO 6400, no problem with that camera, almost no noise. By the way, that's remarkable here too. I should mention that. If you look into the areas here, there is no significant noise in the background, in the more dark areas. Let's go to the brighter areas. Well, you see here is not completely matching on the overexposed image, but nevertheless, absolutely no noise. This image is super clear. And I will conclude now and wrap up the video because I think otherwise it's getting too long. There is a debate which lasted years in the photo community about ISO sensitivity in comparison with noise, in comparison with sensors and crop factors. And the whole topic was, I think, headlined as equivalence. So what means to have 2 equivalent pictures, and how can you play the parameters in the light triangle or different sensor sizes to get them matching? And there was almost a fanatic discussion about that topic. I don't think that takes you very far. My opinion really is, if people have a new camera with a new sensor, do your experimenting yourself. Now on the Leica M10-R, the conclusion is simple. Shooting up to 6400, not a problem. You can go for the ISO 6400 challenge, means you can just shoot everything with that high ISO value because the noise behavior is fantastic. Second is the dynamic range on the Leica M10-R is remarkable, and I would recommend rather going for underexposure with lower ISO values, and that's the big benefit. If you get to know your camera sensor, you know the best behavior will be at the native ISO of the camera, which for the Leica M10-R is an ISO of 100, as you can read in the description by Leica themselves. So it's better to go for an underexposed image with an ISO 100, if the true ISO maybe would be 400 or even 800, and then correct in post, than risking, let's say, a high ISO value and maybe losing structure and details. Having said that, since you can go up to 6400 ISO, all will be fine if you choose higher ISO values. And I think in one of my videos, I even showed ISO values up to 50,000, and even then you get a kind of usable image, which is absolutely remarkable. So dynamic range top, ISO behavior top, noise behavior fantastic, and in general a camera which has a sensor which is probably one of the best you can get today on the planet. If you liked that video, please drop me a thumbs up. Do not forget to subscribe to stay tuned on my content. Thanks for watching and peace out.